It was a cold and rainy Thursday afternoon when Tom entered Marcy's diner. The small, cozy diner was the kind of place where people came to escape the chill of the day, find warmth in a cup of coffee, and enjoy a meal without hurry. Tom was a regular, a man with a story to tell, though most of it stayed locked away behind his quiet smile. He had served his country years ago, a Marine who had lost part of his leg in service. Now he was simply trying to live a peaceful life in a small town, where people knew each other's names, and no one was in a rush. As he wheeled himself through the door, the bell above it chimed lightly. He liked the sound. It was a small comfort in a world that had changed so much since he left the service. Marcy's diner wasn't just any diner. It was a place where everyone knew you, where you didn't have to explain yourself, where people didn't stare at the things that made you different. The waitress, Jenny, greeted him with her usual smile, the one that always seemed to brighten up the space around her. She knew Tom well. They had talked countless times over coffee about life, about memories, and about the simple joys of a quiet afternoon. Today, though, he didn't feel like talking. Maybe it was the weather, or the heaviness in his chest that seemed to come and go. Either way, he just wanted to sit, enjoy his meal, and forget the world for a while. "Same as usual, Tom?" Jenny asked, still smiling as she stood by his table. "Yeah, thank you, Jenny," he replied quietly, nodding toward the menu even though he didn't need to look at it. His usual, pancakes with a side of bacon, a black coffee to go with it. Nothing fancy, nothing special, just the kind of meal that felt like home. Jenny moved off to put in the order, and Tom settled into his seat. He looked out the window at the rain falling in sheets, blurring the world outside. There was something calming about the way the rain fell, steady, predictable, much like the rhythm of the diner itself. It was the kind of place where nothing ever changed, and that was exactly what Tom needed. He took a sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth of it, and leaned back in his seat. The sounds of quiet conversations filled the air around him, the clink of silverware on plates, and the soft hum of the jukebox playing in the corner. It was the kind of peaceful scene that made you forget about everything else, if only for a little while. But as Tom settled deeper into his thoughts, he couldn't shake the feeling that today might be different. There was something in the air, a sense of unease that he couldn't put into words. Maybe it was just the rain, or maybe it was the way things sometimes felt off. Whatever it was, Tom wasn't sure, but he knew he wasn't going to let it ruin his day. He had learned long ago that the best way to handle the world's problems was to keep moving forward, one step at a time. As he stared out the window, waiting for his meal, Tom couldn't know that in just a few moments, his quiet afternoon would take an unexpected turn. The warm, familiar atmosphere in Marcy's diner was suddenly broken when the door swung open with a louder than usual jingle. 3 men walked in, their voices raised in laughter, clearly not concerned about the quiet charm of the diner. They were loud, almost too loud for the small space, and their energy immediately felt out of place. Most of the regulars didn't mind a bit of noise, but this felt different, like a disruption. Tom, who had been lost in his own thoughts, glanced up briefly from his coffee. He wasn't one to judge people, but there was something about their behavior that didn't sit right. They didn't seem like the kind of people who appreciated the quiet, the routine that made this place feel like home for so many. Their laughter felt harsh, and their steps were heavy as they made their way toward an empty booth in the back. Jenny, the waitress, greeted them with the same smile she gave every new customer, but Tom noticed the way she tensed slightly. Maybe she felt it too, the strange energy the men brought with them. One of them, a tall guy wearing a worn leather jacket, caught Jenny's eye and flashed her a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Get us something good to eat," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire diner to hear. "Of course," Jenny replied, though her voice was a bit quieter than usual. She quickly turned and walked back toward the kitchen. The group of men sat down and started talking amongst themselves. Their voices weren't soft, and every word seemed to carry further than it should. They laughed again, but this time, Tom couldn't help but overhear a comment that made him freeze. "Look at that guy," one of the men said, loud enough for everyone in the diner to hear. Tom didn't look up, didn't want to make eye contact. He just continued staring at his coffee, his grip tightening slightly on the mug. The words were slow, almost drawn out. "Think he's a hero or something? Probably just wants attention." The other two men snickered, and Tom could feel their eyes on him. He didn't look up, didn't want to give them the satisfaction, but it was hard to ignore the weight of their words, as if they had just thrown something heavy into the calm air of the diner. The laughter continued for a moment, and then it paused. For a second, it felt like the whole room was holding its breath. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as though the world outside had stopped too, and all that was left was the awkward hum of the jukebox playing softly in the background. Jenny returned with their food, a smile still on her face, but even Tom could see that her hands were shaking just a little as she set down the plates. She tried to keep the mood light, but the tension in the air was hard to ignore. The men began to eat, still loud and careless, but there was something different now, something that made the diner feel less like the safe place it usually was. Tom kept his gaze lowered, his mind racing. He wasn't the type to make a scene, but he could feel it building inside him, a quiet storm. Something wasn't right. And as much as he tried to push it aside, he knew that this wasn't going to be just another ordinary meal. The diner seemed to shrink with every passing minute. The loud laughter of the three men had faded into a kind of low, almost uncomfortable hum. They kept talking, but now it was less about casual conversation and more about jabs, comments thrown in Tom's direction, just loud enough for him to hear. "You know, it's a shame," one of the men said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Guys like that, they get all the attention. Act like they're the heroes, but what do they really do?" The others chuckled, but it wasn't a genuine laugh. It was the kind of laughter that made people uncomfortable, the kind that made you feel small. Tom's grip on his coffee tightened, his knuckles turning pale. He kept his head down, hoping that if he ignored them, they would stop. But they didn't. The man in the leather jacket, who had been speaking the most, leaned back in his seat and raised his voice, as if he wanted to make sure everyone in the diner was listening. "Heroes, huh? What's so heroic about sitting around all day, getting a free ride while the rest of us work our butts off?" Tom's face remained calm, but his heart began to race. He had heard words like this before, and they always stung. They weren't just insults. They were judgments, made without knowing anything about him or the sacrifices he had made. But Tom wasn't the type to argue, not in a place like this, not over something as small as a comment from strangers. He had learned long ago that it wasn't worth it. Jenny, the waitress, noticed it too. She stopped in the middle of serving another table, her eyes darting between the men and Tom. She looked uncomfortable, her fingers trembling as she placed a glass of water on the table. It was clear she wanted to say something, maybe tell the men to stop or ask them to leave, but she didn't. She just forced a smile and kept moving. The tension was thick now, like the air before a storm. Other customers began to shift in their seats, their eyes flickering toward the group of men, and then quickly back down to their meals. No one said anything, but it was obvious that everyone felt it. The diner, once a place of calm and familiarity, was starting to feel hostile. Tom's mind raced as he tried to block out the voices. He focused on his coffee, trying to calm his nerves, but the words kept echoing in his head. Heroes, freed ride. He wasn't sure if he should stand up and walk out, or if he should just ignore them and hope it would end. He didn't want to cause a scene, but it was getting harder and harder to pretend it didn't matter. And then, just as he was about to take another sip of coffee, the loudest laugh came from the group. They had crossed a line, making a comment about him so clear and so pointed that even the other diners couldn't pretend they didn't hear it. It was a line they couldn't take back, and suddenly, it was no longer just about words. It was about respect. Tom's fingers curled around his coffee cup, and for the first time in the last few minutes, he made a decision. He wasn't going to sit here quietly anymore. Just as the tension in the diner seemed to reach its peak, something unexpected happened. Sitting at a table 2 booths away from Tom, a woman named Rachel glanced up from her meal. She had only recently moved back to town and hadn't been a regular here for long. But today, as she took in the uncomfortable scene, something inside her snapped. She wasn't the type to get involved in situations like this, but something about the cruelty in the men's words stirred something deep within her. She noticed how Tom's hands gripped his coffee cup tighter with every passing insult, how his face remained calm on the outside, but his posture seemed to shrink under the weight of the words. She saw the way Jenny, The waitress kept glancing nervously at the group, clearly unsure of what to do. And for the first time, Rachel realized that if no one spoke up, if no one stood up for Tom, this moment could linger in the air long after the men had left. Without thinking too much, Rachel stood up from her table and walked toward Tom. The sudden movement caught the attention of everyone in the diner. She was calm, her steps purposeful but not rushed. The clatter of silverware paused for a moment as people took notice of what was happening. When Rachel reached Tom's table, she paused just long enough for him to notice her. She didn't look at the men who had been making the comments. She didn't need to. Instead, she smiled at Tom, a warm, easy smile that somehow felt like a quiet act of defiance in the face of what had just been happening. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, her voice steady but kind. "I could use some good company." Tom looked up, his expression softening as he met her eyes. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but there was something reassuring in the way she spoke. He nodded, unsure of what to say at first. "Of course," he replied quietly, feeling a slight relief that someone was willing to sit with him in the middle of this. His voice was calm, but the simple act of sharing the space with someone felt like a small shield against the harshness of the situation. Rachel slid into the seat across from him, the sound of her chair scraping softly against the floor as she did. She didn't acknowledge the group of men or their laughter, didn't need to. Instead, she turned her focus to Tom, as though he were the only person in the room. "You don't mind, do you?" she asked, her eyes glancing briefly at the group of men who were now watching them. It wasn't a question for Tom so much as a challenge thrown at the group. She wasn't going to let the atmosphere of the diner be ruined by the cruelty of a few strangers. Tom looked at her for a long moment, still processing what had just happened. He had expected silence, maybe a few awkward moments, but not this. Not someone willing to speak up, to stand with him without hesitation. He wasn't used to this kind of support, not after all these years of quiet suffering. "No," he said finally, his voice stronger now, a quiet sense of gratitude mixing with his surprise. "I don't mind at all." For a brief moment, the room seemed to exhale. The tension that had been hanging in the air started to fade, and the other customers, who had been quietly watching, began to look away, unsure whether they were witnessing a confrontation or just a simple act of kindness. Either way, something had shifted. The sudden shift in the diner's energy was almost palpable. The group of men who had been laughing and making cruel remarks only moments before now sat in silence. Their eyes moved between Rachel and Tom, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't a confrontation, not in the loud, angry way they had expected. It was something quieter, something that made them uncomfortable in a way they weren't used to. Rachel didn't acknowledge them. She didn't need to. Her focus remained entirely on Tom. She turned to him with a calm smile and spoke softly. "It's good to sit with someone who understands what it means to be strong." Her words weren't loud or pointed, but they carried a certain weight. It was as though she was reminding everyone in the diner, without ever saying it directly, that strength wasn't about picking fights. It was about knowing when to stand firm and when to sit quietly with another person. Tom, still processing what had just happened, gave her a small nod. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected anyone to stand up for him. But there she was, sitting across from him, offering him nothing more than her presence. And somehow, that was enough. The rest of the diner watched in quiet anticipation, unsure how to react. The men at the back booth, still unsure how to proceed, began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Their laughter had been replaced by awkward glances, and they seemed to sense that they had crossed some invisible line. No one had raised their voice, no one had made a scene, but the weight of their actions was clear. They weren't just being rude anymore. They were being seen for what they were. Jenny, the waitress, returned to the table, her steps slow but steady. She didn't need to say anything. Her gaze spoke volumes. She offered a warm smile to Rachel and Tom, as though thanking them for breaking the tension without saying a word. It was a small act, but it spoke to the kind of quiet solidarity that had always existed in the diner, just beneath the surface. The group of men, realizing that their presence no longer held the same power, began to gather their things. One by one, they stood up, their chairs scraping the floor as they moved toward the door. The room, which had been filled with their loud voices only moments before, was now completely silent. It was as if they had been removed from the space altogether, their exit marked only by the soft sound of the door closing behind them. As the door swung shut, a quiet ripple of relief spread through the diner. The tension that had been building for so long seemed to lift with their departure. People who had been holding their breath now began to exhale, returning to their meals, their conversations, their comfort. No one made a big deal of it. There were no grand gestures, no loud applause. But everyone in the diner knew that something had changed. Tom, feeling the weight of the moment lift from his shoulders, looked at Rachel with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft but sincere. He didn't need to explain. She had done exactly what he needed without asking for anything in return. Rachel simply nodded, her smile still gentle. "We all deserve respect," she said, her words quiet but firm. And in that simple truth, the room found its peace once again. As the last of the men left the diner, the room seemed to return to its natural rhythm, but a certain stillness lingered in the air. It wasn't the loud chatter or the clinking of forks against plates that filled the space now. It was something more subtle, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm, when the wind has stopped howling and all you hear is the soft rustling of leaves. Tom sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment slowly lift from his shoulders. He hadn't realized just how much he'd been holding in, not until he felt the sudden calm that came with the men's departure. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't feel like an outsider in his own town. He didn't feel like he was being watched or judged. He was just another person in the diner, sitting at his usual table, enjoying his meal. Jenny returned to her usual duties, but her smile was different now, warmer, as though the air had cleared, and she could breathe a little easier. She paused by Tom's table, refilling his coffee with a gentle hand. "You all right, Tom?" she asked, her voice soft, but full of concern. Tom nodded, offering her a small smile. "Yeah, better now," he replied. His words were quiet, but there was a sense of relief in his tone that hadn't been there before. He took a slow sip of his coffee, savoring the warmth of it. It wasn't just the drink that comforted him. It was the sense that the world was, for once, on his side, that there were people out there who saw him, who understood him. Rachel, still sitting across from him, looked out the window at the rain, which had slowed to a steady drizzle. The world outside seemed to reflect the peaceful calm that had settled in the diner. She didn't say anything for a few moments, just letting the quiet settle around them. She wasn't in a rush. She didn't need to be anywhere. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had made the right choice by speaking up, by sitting down with Tom in the face of everything that had happened. After a few moments of comfortable silence, Rachel spoke again. "It's funny, isn't it?" she said softly, turning her gaze toward him. "How people think they can make others feel small just to make themselves feel bigger. But it's really the quiet ones, the ones who don't fight back right away, who show the real strength." Her words weren't directed at anyone in particular, but at the world itself, at the way things sometimes worked in life. Tom looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's not about fighting back. Sometimes it's just about not letting them win." Rachel smiled, a small, knowing smile. Exactly. As the last of the afternoon's light faded, the diner began to return to its usual pace. Customers came and went, conversations resumed, and the jukebox played softly in the background. But for Tom and Rachel, the world had shifted in a subtle but meaningful way. They didn't need to say much more. The quiet understanding between them was enough. The diner, once again, felt like a safe place, a place where people respected one another, where kindness could still be found in the most unexpected of moments. As the hours passed, the diner slowly returned to its usual buzz, but something had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The air felt a little lighter, the conversations a little warmer. People seemed to be speaking a little more kindly, even the regulars who often kept to themselves. It was as if the small act of standing up, of showing kindness in a moment of cruelty, had shifted the atmosphere in a way that no one could fully explain. Tom had finished his meal and was now sipping the last of his coffee, lost in his thoughts. He was surprised by how calm he felt. He hadn't expected such a simple act of support to have such a big impact. When he first came into the diner, he'd been on edge, expecting the same old treatment. He hadn't expected anything to change, but sitting there with Rachel, a stranger who had just shown him respect, had reminded him of something important, that there were people out there who didn't judge based on appearances or past mistakes. Jenny stopped by his table once more, this time with a gentle smile. "You sure you don't need anything else, Tom?" she asked. Her voice was more relaxed now, no longer laced with the tension that had marked her tone earlier. Tom shook his head, smiling back at her. "No, I'm good. Thanks for everything, though." She nodded, her smile deepening. "You know, I think you were right not to let them get to you," she said quietly, almost as if she were speaking more to herself than to him. "Sometimes people just need a reminder that they're not the ones in charge of how we feel." He couldn't help but chuckle softly. Maybe, he replied. But it's hard sometimes, isn't it, when people think they can push you around? Jenny shrugged, a thoughtful look crossing her face. Yeah, but sometimes it's not about fighting back. It's about not letting them win. You're doing fine, Tom. Better than most people would, I think. Her words stayed with him as she walked away to tend to the next table. For the first time in a long while, Tom felt like he had found his place. Not just in the diner, but in the world. It wasn't about making a big statement, about standing up in front of everyone and shouting to be heard. It was about the quiet moments, the ones where people respected each other without expecting anything in return. Rachel, who had been sitting quietly across from him, finally stood up, her hand resting gently on the edge of the table. I should get going, she said, offering him a smile. But I'm glad we sat here together. It's nice to know that kindness still matters. Tom nodded, his eyes meeting hers with a sense of quiet understanding. Yeah, it really does. As Rachel headed toward the door, Tom watched her go, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude. She had been a stranger to him just hours ago, yet her simple act of standing by him had made all the difference. Sometimes he realized it wasn't the grand gestures that changed the world. Sometimes it was the small, everyday acts of courage, the willingness to speak up when no one else would. When he finally stood up to leave, Tom felt lighter than he had in years. He paid his bill, gave Jenny a nod, and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The sky had cleared up, and the streets were bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. Everything felt a little brighter, a little more hopeful. He wasn't sure what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to face it. The next few days in town felt different. The diner, a place that had always been a quiet refuge for many, seemed to have undergone a subtle transformation. It wasn't because of any major changes. The menu was still the same, the coffee still brewed strong, and the familiar hum of conversations continued as usual. But something had shifted. The air felt lighter, as if the tension that had once settled over the place had been cleared away. Tom returned to the diner the following week. He had been hesitant at first, wondering if things would go back to how they had been. But when he walked through the door, he was met with nothing but warmth. Jenny greeted him with a smile, just as she always had, but this time there was something different in her eyes. She wasn't just offering him a polite greeting. There was a sense of mutual respect in her look, as though the air between them had cleared in a way that couldn't be undone. Hey, Tom, Jenny said, her voice cheerful but genuine. Same as usual? Tom smiled back, feeling an unfamiliar sense of peace. Yeah, that sounds good. As he sat down at his usual booth, he noticed a few of the regulars chatting a little more openly with each other, exchanging smiles and laughs. There was a sense of camaraderie now, a quiet understanding that everyone here, whether they were a newcomer or a longtime customer, deserved to be treated with dignity. Rachel's actions had rippled through the diner, touching more people than she likely realized. The men who had been rude to Tom, those who had tested the waters of cruelty, hadn't come back to the diner. Maybe they were ashamed of their behavior, or maybe they had simply lost interest in trying to disrupt the peaceful rhythm of the place. Whatever the reason, their absence left a space for something better to grow. Tom didn't know if Rachel had expected such an impact when she sat down with him that day. Maybe she had just been trying to make him feel less alone in that moment, but in doing so, she had sparked something larger than either of them could have imagined. A small act of kindness, the quiet stand against cruelty, had opened a door to change. It wasn't about confrontation or loud gestures. It was about standing firm in the face of disrespect and showing that kindness could and would prevail. As Tom took a sip of his coffee, he reflected on how much things had shifted, not just in the diner, but in himself. He felt stronger, not because he had fought back or won some battle, but because he had allowed himself to be seen. He had allowed himself to believe that he deserved respect, and in doing so, he had set an example for others to follow. When he finished his meal, he paid his bill and stood to leave. Jenny was there to wish him well as he headed for the door, but there was no need for words. The simple act of being there, of coming back to this place where he was accepted, was enough. He stepped outside into the bright afternoon, breathing in the fresh air, feeling a quiet sense of hope for the future. The town had changed, and so had he. Sometimes, all it took to make a difference was a small act of kindness and the willingness to stand by someone who needed it. And in this diner, in this town, that difference would continue to echo long after he left.